Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Trey Hester, Digital Director for War on the Rocks. This episode of Horns of a Dilemma is part of a special series of live episodes bringing you into the room at the 2019 Intelligence Studies Project Symposium at the University of Texas at Austin. In the second installment, Robert Chesney, Director of the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, moderates a panel on emerging threats, technology challenges, and institutional change. The panelists include Michelle Van Cleve, former National Counterintelligence Executive, Matthew Travis, Deputy Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, Samantha Ravitch, Fellow at the Foundation for Defense and Democracies, Michael Daniel, former Special Assistant to the President and White House Cybersecurity Coordinator, and John Carlin, former Assistant Attorney General for National Security. The event was sponsored by the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law, the Clements Center for National Security, and the LBJ School of Public Affairs.
In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know we're still milling about, and that's fine. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Professor Bobby Chesney. I'm the director of the Strauss Center, one of the sponsoring institutions. I'm the James Baker Chair here at the University of Texas. And I am really excited about this panel precisely because in our earlier discussions, speaking with intelligence professionals, including current professionals, as we saw in the last Q&A, they are constrained by design, constrained in their ability to engage on questions of policy. But that leaves open a lot of interesting questions for our panel to wrestle with. We have a lot of questions of policy under the general headings of emerging threats, emerging technologies, emerging opportunities, and questions of institutional design for the intelligence community in light of all that. And let's remember, the overarching theme of the event is this question of whether for once in our history, perhaps we might evolve, if not revolutionize, the design of what it is we do in the intelligence enterprise without first having a Pearl Harbor level or 9/11 level of provocation. Can we be more foresightful? Our panel's terrific. I'm going to give a quick introduction to them, and then we're going to have a brief initial statement from one of our guests, and then we're going to go into moderated dialogue mode. We have a bunch of topics I want to get them talking about. And I said to them that my injunction to y'all, and I repeat it now, is to please forget all them and imagine that we're all just at the bar hanging out talking about our favorite topics. And you should engage each other, contradict each other, argue with each other, or reinforce each other as you see fit. But I'm looking forward to a real discussion on these topics. Now to do this, we've got a terrific crew. The full bios are long, impressive, and in your materials. Let me just state a few highlights. Matthew Travis is the inaugural Deputy Director of DHS's newly renamed Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, properly pronounced CISA, I believe. Not CISA, CISA. In that capacity, he and Director Krebs oversee the Cybersecurity Division, the Infrastructure Security Division, National Risk Management Center, Emergency Communications Division, many other exciting things. He's got a strong background as well in the private sector in relation to Homeland Security-focused ventures. He's a former Navy officer, including time as a White House military aide and the White House liaison to the Secretary of the Navy. Samantha Ravitch is with us. She's chair of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation and the Transformative Cyber Innovation Lab at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. She's also principal investigator of FDD's Cyber-Enabled Economic Warfare Project. Samantha serves as vice chair of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. She's a member of the congressionally mandated Cyberspace Solarium Commission. She previously served as Vice President Cheney's Deputy National Security Advisor, where she focused on Asian and Middle East affairs, as well as counterterrorism and counterproliferation issues. Michael Daniel is President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. But before that, he spent 5 years in the White House as Special Assistant to President Obama and Cybersecurity Coordinator on the National Security Council staff, a role that had Michael in the thick of things in developing the national cybersecurity strategy and related policies, and focusing on U.S. government partnerships with the private sector, with NGOs, with foreign partners. Michelle Van Cleve is currently president of National Security Concepts, as well as a principal with the Jack Kemp Foundation. She served as our nation's national counterintelligence executive under President George W. Bush. As head of U.S. counterintelligence, she was responsible for providing strategic direction to and ensuring the integration of our counterintelligence activities across the federal government. And she's held senior staff positions in Congress, at the Pentagon, the White House Science Office. John Carlin currently a partner with the well-known and respected law firm Morrison Foerster, previously served as the Assistant Attorney General heading the DOJ National Security Division, where he played a central role as the NSD began to adapt its focus to address national security-related cyber threats. He also has served as Chief of Staff and Senior Counsel to FBI Director, name, let me check that, Bob Mueller? Heard of that? In addition to his private law practice, John is currently chairing the Aspen Institute's fantastic cybersecurity and technology policy program, which is a really neat and innovative operation. And best of all, you've got to get online on Amazon and order a copy of his extremely excellent book. That's a technical term. Extremely excellent book, Dawn of the Code War. That's with Garrett Graff. It's a terrific book. Everybody in our field is talking about it. So we're excited to have them all here. I'm going to ask Matthew to come up because CISA as an institution in this milieu is relatively new, and it'd be great if he could share some words about it to introduce it. You can either do that from there, which is fine. Here. Yeah. And then once we've done that, we'll move into our moderated dialogue.
Right. Thanks, Bobby. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you. As Bobby said, I'm the Deputy Director of CISA, and as Admiral Inman suggested and Deputy Director Gordon validated, that means I must be miserable, right? So, but I'm not necessarily miserable today. Who could be miserable in Austin, especially with this crowd? So Bobby and Stephen, thanks for the invitation. And it's certainly, as Philip Bobbitt said, it's great to see so many students in the audience. But when I say, I think a few of you matriculated some time ago. So it's also good to see such a vibrant engagement from the business community, as well as the citizenry of Central Texas. So thanks for carving out your day for this. I just wanted to touch on, CISA is the newest agency in the federal government. Most people haven't heard of it, so I just want to give a quick plug for it. It was formed on November 16th of last year when President Trump signed it into law. And what it really does, for anyone who is tracking at DHS, what used to be the aptly named National Protection and Programs Directorate was really just a loose confederation of various programs. This act transformed us into what we really are, which is the nation's leading civilian cybersecurity agency. And so what we do at CISA are a few things. For one, we protect federal networks. We play defense. We defend the .gov domain for all federal agencies. And we also share information with the commercial as well as the private sector, non-governmental organizations on the cyber front. And we manage the 16 sectors of critical infrastructure, both on the physical side as well on the cyber side. So from aviation to communications to critical manufacturing to dams, we work those partnerships that you heard Deputy Director Gordon talk about, trying to build resilience, develop training and exercises, share information, and ultimately reduce risk. We also have an emergency communications division, which was dedicated to advancing interoperable communications among first responders, also has a national communications element to it. And then finally, Bobby mentioned this, the National Risk Management Center, which is newly created from last summer, in which we repurposed another part of the agency to deal with long-term national critical functions, the strategic risk, systemic risk to what's really important in the country, the big stuff. So it's not the National Risk Management Center, it's the National Risk Management Center. Things like elections, like the grid, the wholesale clearing function in financial transactions. Those things, if it goes sideways, it's a bad day in America. So we work with the private sector to try to identify those vulnerabilities, understand those cross-sector dependencies, and ultimately try to buy down risk against those critical functions. So our motto is defend today, secure tomorrow, which is a recognition that we have to play both the short game and the long game, dealing with who's trying to attack us now, both virtually and from terrorist groups, but also trying to build that long-term resilience, that long-term reducing that systemic risk to what makes this country great. So it's CISA. I'm a bit of a grammar snob, so yes, LISA is Lisa, VISA is Visa, CISA is CISA. So I had to bite my lower lip for that one. Thanks, Bobby.
That's terrific. Well, listen, in my opening remarks, Samantha, when I was introducing you, I mentioned cyber-enabled economic warfare, CEEW. We like acronyms in this community, so CEEW. Can you introduce this concept to us? What is this all about?
Sure. Cyber-enabled economic warfare refers to the purposeful use of cyber means by an adversary to undermine and attack the economic elements of a rival in order to weaken that country strategically or militarily, right? So it is not just the theft of money out of banks for money's sake, using cyber means, or even the theft of IP to gain a market advantage. But it is really to undermine the key economic elements of a country in order to weaken that country strategically and militarily. We've been looking at this for the past number of years and trying to understand the intentions and capabilities of hostile adversaries, North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, their use of these means, because we are only the strongest military in the world because we're the strongest economy in the world, right? Our strength as a country depends on our economic wherewithal, on our innovation base. This is what makes us a great country. When we forget that, we suffer because of it. And adversaries know that. They know that this is our strength. And so they're purposely hollowing out key parts of our economy. So that's what we focus on. And that is cyber-enabled economic warfare.
This obviously raises a question about what we can do about it. John, you were, in your time at NSD, very much in the thick of recognizing some aspects of this problem and taking key steps. You might even say you were sort of present at the, dawn of the Code War, even. Tell us about what, a lot of your experience is all about this, coming to grips with it. Tell us about that.
Got to bring Bobby around more generally to sell this book.
You'll get a bill later.
And we had, it was great to hear from John Demers earlier, longtime friend dating back to law school and colleague in the Bush administration. And there's a lot of talk about the massive differences in approach between President Obama and President Trump, and there are many things that they do not have in common. But I think what you heard today is that there is great continuity when it comes to the approach of the National Security Division. It's the same career professionals, and they're seeing the same, they're seeing what the intelligence community has provided to them in terms of the portrait of the threat. And that threat is that, in particular, China, but nation-state adversaries from Iran, North Korea, Russia, when it comes to cyber activity that is increasingly blended. So on the one hand, it is hitting traditional targets and attempting to collect intelligence. But on the other hand, they're using cyber-enabled activity to do what we would normally call just criminal behavior, right? North Korea committed what would be one of the greatest bank heists in history using cyber-enabled means, in part to evade US sanctions and get cash into their economy. Russia increasingly is a kleptocratic state. Its autocracy uses openly and flagrantly criminal gangs that operate with notoriety on the streets of Moscow and other cities, who day in, day out are hitting American companies in order to steal information just to make a buck. And then those same cyber criminals are being tasked by the intelligence officers, FSB officers in Russia. And we've seen that playbook now laid out in a great case that was brought in this administration, begun before, again, the continuity with Yahoo, where in the same case, and that's a case where we looked for Russian cooperation, and we said, here's one of our most wanted cyber criminals, and like other areas, such as the exploitation of children or terrorists, cyber criminals are bad for everyone, let's work together. So we said, here's our most wanted criminal, please help us arrest them. And not only didn't they arrest him, they signed him up as an intelligence asset. And that's what created the biggest loss of email compromised accounts in the Yahoo hack. And finally, China, where we've been working with Sam and her group, we brought that first case, and I think for a conference around the subject of the transformation of intelligence. This was a case, the indictment of 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, Unit 61398, that made the lives of intelligence agents and officers more difficult. Right? So we laid out publicly the noisy tradecraft that these Chinese uniformed officers were using in order to steal economic information, trade secrets, trade negotiation strategies from companies that were not traditional intelligence targets, ranging from Westinghouse trying to lease a lead pipe, and the night before, the Chinese agents went in and stole the technical design specifications, to a solar company that was a US subsidiary of a German multinational. They stole the pricing information for the solar product, and use that information to price dump and successfully force that solar company into bankruptcy. And then to add insult to injury, and as the lawyer on the panel, when that company sued for saying that this was unfair trade practices, they stole the whole litigation strategy out from the lawyers. And so if we're going to address this problem, it's going to mean making public what the intelligence community is showing us about what these nation states are doing. And every time we do that, that means their tradecraft is going to improve, and it's going to get more difficult for the intelligence officers to collect in the future. And I hope that's one of the subjects we tackle today.
This is, to a substantial extent, a discussion about commercial espionage, but for national security and commercial purposes. So it's a counterintelligence problem. Michelle, can you talk about how do we frame this and think about this through the counterintelligence lens?
So that's a very interesting question, because from my perspective, so much of this is a reminder of Counterintelligence 101, and that begins with understanding what is it that foreign intelligence services do. They will seek to acquire our secrets, to compromise our technological capabilities by stealing things that are going to be of value to them, and to manipulate manipulate our perceptions of what they're doing, to deceive us with respect to what they're doing, to deceive our decision makers, to hide. These are a variety of things that foreign intelligence services do, and all of them are done for political purposes. As Lenin said, all intelligence activities have a political purpose, and the purpose of counterintelligence is to try to discern what those activities are and find ways of stopping them. But all of these things are done for advantage, and foreign governments use their intelligence services as a strategic make-weight to look for areas where we have vulnerabilities, where they may find advantage. So as we talk about things that have to do with these commercial activities with respect to, say, Chinese targeting of our technology, of our R&D base, I am struck by what one of Admiral Inman's successors, General Keith Alexander, said most memorably, that this is the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. And we're sitting here and we're watching it happen, and we're having a great deal of difficulty dealing with how do we stop it. So I find it fascinating that we talk about cyber-enabled economic warfare, knowing full well that the use of economic measures to try to gain advantage is certainly not new to the cyber age, but also predates that. And so what I find most interesting, and maybe we can talk more about this in time, is the marriage between cyber-enabled activities and human activities as they present challenges to us in dealing with them.
Your last comment really draws out how, yes, there's a lot of what we're talking about that's taking place in the cyber domain, but it'd be a mistake to think that's the only lens through which we should look at these larger set of intentions and goals through which foreign actors are moving. And Michael, that makes me want to come over to you and ask about it. We've already talked about the U.S. response a little bit from the DOJ specific perspective. From the White House, where you were sitting, of course, your charge was to think about it much more from the whole of government perspective. How did you think about it then, and has that changed in retrospect as you reflect back on your years, which also were at the dawn of the Code Wars?
One more plug for John's book.
Right.
It is.
I don't get any money.
But, it's. But I'm feeling the lack of a beer if I was actually at a bar. But anyway, but I think what I would say is that one of the key realizations that started to emerge, and you heard Sue reflecting on this as well, is that for a long time we treated cybersecurity as if it were purely a technical problem. And it was something that all the organizations that dealt with this issue you would hope that you could relegate it to the geek in the closet that you never actually had to talk to, right? But what we have discovered is that cybersecurity is it's a political problem, it's an economic problem, it's a human psychology problem. I mean, think about the things that cybersecurity experts tell you to do, right? We tell you, you should have a 16-character password that is not a word in any known language, that includes a in there as well, and have a different one of these for every single website that you visit. Right. Like any person's actually going to be able to do that. So we have conflated the technical issues with and not understood the other aspects of the problem. Similarly, for many years, we also tried to apply purely technical tools, and it was always sort of referred to as cyber on cyber. And that the idea was that if they came at you in cyberspace, you had to go back at them in cyberspace. And so one of the things that John was responsible for was saying, well, no, we can actually use some legal tools to address that. We also looked at developing economic tools. So we put in place the ability to impose economic sanctions on people that were conducting malicious cyber activity. So we started broadening the aperture of the tools that were available to counter what's going on. Because the truth is, you can't understand what China is doing in cyberspace without understanding their broader geopolitical environment that they're operating in. And so these things really can't be separated. And so a lot of what started to emerge during my time in the White House is this idea of actually, how do we actually fuse what we're seeing and doing in cyberspace with all the other elements of national power, from diplomatic to military to law enforcement to intelligence to economic capabilities across the board.
I'll just add, if there's any doubt among the audience whether or not cyber-enabled economic warfare is a thing, I'll just cite one data point in that we have certainly seen a much greater demand signal from the private sector to work with us because of this persistent attack on our companies and our banks and our infrastructure. For a long time, DHS is 16 years old, and as the panels will attest, we're not always the first folks that people wanted to work with. There wasn't a lot of trust established, so they didn't want to trust with their data. They weren't sure what value we could provide. But lately, this notion of nation state versus companies has made American firms realize that they need to lock arms much more closely with government, with DHS, because it's not a fair fight. I mean, during the Cold War, we were all at risk. We were all targeted by Soviet ICBMs, and we still are. But the Soviet Union wasn't targeting J.P. Morgan Chase. It wasn't targeting American energy companies. They are now, and so firms see that they need a closer relationship with the government because they want to see the information we have. We would like to see what's on the network. So there's a mutual interest to work more closely together, because this notion of cyber-enabled economic warfare it's not a passing fad.
But I would interject on that point that there really is a little history behind what you're doing where, in fact, even during the Cold War, where the threat is clear and the need for a government-industry relationship is clear, there still was partnership. And I recall when I was in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy back in the Cold War days, there was a very effective relationship then with the telecommunications providers that grew out of a history of understanding that the Soviet Union then presented a threat to the telecommunications infrastructure of the United States, which was so clear when the Cuban Missile Crisis hit. And all of the circuits were overloaded, and government users couldn't get through to the people they needed to talk to. And AT&T came forward and started to work with the government to ensure that there would be resiliency and enough communications redundancy to enable those emergency uses. And fast forward over time and the breakup of AT&T and a continuing relationship, you, I think, have inherited what had previously been a more concentrated area in telecom has now come to you. But I think that the lesson from that for all of us is it's the clarity of saying, being able for the government to say to industry, this is what we're going to achieve, this is what you get out of it, this is what we need from you, and this is how it's going to work. So when those emergency preparedness lines are well drawn and well understood, I think we get good advantage out of it. And so that's over to you.
But I would also say that one of the things we're still struggling with is that the physics and math of cyberspace are different. We're used to having this mental model of how the world interacts, and we're used to this mental model of how long it takes to get from point A to point B. And in a nodal light speed network, the concepts of distance and proximity are completely different. And so we end up with these situations where so anybody who tells you that cyberspace is borderless is wrong. There are borders everywhere in cyberspace. They just don't line up with the physical borders that we've drawn in the real world. And the data flows across those physical borders very easily. And so what you end up with is these weird situations where, so during the Iranian DDoS attacks on our banks. So the financial sector comes into the US government and says, we really want you to make this problem stop. Okay, would you like us to put some NSA boxes on your networks? No, no. Would you like us to build the great firewall of the United States? No. What are you actually asking us to do? Well, we just want you to make the problem go away. Okay, but we can't do that directly because the nature of cyberspace that you've embraced so strongly, private industry, that allows you to reach out and touch customers directly without any intermediaries, guess what? The bad guys can reach out and touch you without any intermediaries, I also. And so this whole new environment, you heard Sue talking about this. So in this environment, what do we actually want the role of government? What do we want the role of the private sector? And how do we actually put that together? We're going to need some new institutions and some new ways of doing business in order to actually deal with these new realities.
One problem is certainly that. Another possible problem has to do with a cultural change I think has taken place. It was on my mind, Michelle, as you were describing the sort of the good old days of AT&T very patriotically cooperating with the government. We don't live in that world anymore, and it's not just that the companies have changed. The mindset and the culture of many of the most important tech companies and also other aspects of the private sector, it's much more globalized, more cosmopolitan, and to a certain extent has a very different view of old Mr. Snowden than we were talking about earlier when we were looking at Snowden from the point of view of the harm he did to security by exposing intelligence activities and capabilities. There are many places, especially in Silicon Valley, I would say, where he's viewed as somewhat of a hero, more of a libertarian ethos. And as a result, you've got a lot of key companies who either we as a US government set of national security institutions would like cooperation from, or that are themselves being subjected to attack and need to work with the government in some way, who are not remotely as comfortable working with the US government as would have been the case with major corporate entities in the 20th century. So I invite any of you to jump in with reflections on whether this is that descriptively right, and how much trouble does this cause for us? Samantha?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there is probably a smaller cadre of companies that actually fall into that concerning basket than what encompasses the national security. Let's just talk the national security industrial base supply chain, right? And because that is a very large basket of suppliers and vendors that work up and down the national security enterprise. And, and this is big. The Defense Department budget alone, $685 billion. If the Defense Department were its own economy, it'd be the 22nd largest economy in the world, right? So there are a lot of people and a lot of vendors and a lot of actors that actually are in this, in this ecosphere. But, but even the ones that are working with the U.S. government in some form or fashion, are threat vectors for the U.S. government because I mentioned supply chain, and I do want to mention one piece about this, because when we think about new tools of the trade, new innovation in the intelligence community, what we may need going forward to get at some of these thorny problems that we're up here talking about, understanding the vulnerabilities to the U.S. government and therefore to the U.S. citizenry from how hostile adversaries are getting into our supply chain, malicious hardware, compromised software, counterfeit goods, is truly keeps me up at night because look, if lines of code, and Michael can talk more about that, but if lines of code are malicious code is inserted into, let's just say, no one has suggested that it was purposeful lines of code in the 10 million lines of code that go into the Boeing 737 MCAS system, right? But we do know it was a software glitch, or at least that's what people are saying. No one says it was purposeful, but if it were, you can see how it quickly becomes something that can paralyze a country, paralyze an economy, paralyze a military. And we have yet to get our arms around that problem. It will call for new ways of gathering intelligence, new ways of assessing intelligence, new ways of deploying the information that we learn. There's an old phrase that amateurs do strategy and professionals do logistics. I think now it leans more towards amateurs do strategy and professionals do supply chain. But anyway.
John?
I agree with the premise. I think it's overstated, and in the current position, I help a lot of victims who've been hit by nation-state attacks. And the reason why they don't go into the government isn't because of some libertarian philosophical view. It's because our regulatory regime is set up in a way that punishes you if you go in. And a lot of the remedies, which are well-intentioned but are oriented around privacy, I don't know, raise your hand if you've received some type of notice that your information has been stolen. So it's the entire room. So I've gotten, like 15? I think my daughter's first piece of mail addressed to her was that her information had been taken in the Office of Personnel Management breach. She was very excited to have her name on a letter. But what are we supposed to do with that information, and why are we incentivizing companies to endlessly tell the individuals, but we don't have any requirement that they tell the government or law enforcement or intelligence when they see that's based around what the threat actor is, or when they're looking for what might be much more damaging information, supply chain compromise, trade secret information. Right now, what we regulate primarily is personally identifiable information, names, addresses, which I think is quite important. But if we want to change the behavior, then we have to ask them to tell the right people the right information, and we seem unwilling to tackle that. One of the things about being out is someone was saying to me that the great thing is you get to say whatever you want. The bad side is nobody cares, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. So number one, we ought to be incentivizing companies to share information that's not necessarily public, but goes to the law enforcement and intelligence agencies so they can action it. Number two, and Sue talked about this earlier today in her discussions, I mean, Matt can comment on how it is without taking a view, but it is still the case that the vast majority of information that the government has is collected and stored in a manner that makes it very, very difficult to share with the private sector. So when they go and do a call and say, I'm getting hit and it looks a lot like, and this guy who's my lawyer is telling me this is the Iranians, is it the Iranians? The answer is, we'll get back to you. We're not sure that we can tell you that information. If they ask for certain indicators of compromise, IP addresses that have been linked to Iran or China or Russia, the answer is, well, some of those are live. We're not sure we can give them to you to protect your system.
Actually, it's more frustrating than that, because then the government says to the private sector, no, but give us everything.
Give us ours, yes. Right. And then the third, just to throw out there, is sanctions, because my successor, John Demers, earlier said that's a Treasury Department distinction, so I don't have to do that anymore. So it's ridiculous that we haven't used the executive order that was designed in the first place to stop Chinese economic espionage at a time that the current president of the United States and his national security team is saying that's our top, or one of our top strategic problems. We have not used that executive order to sanction a Chinese company for stealing trade secrets, or anyone from China, since it was signed. So it has never been used in relation to China. If we want to change behavior, we got to use the tools that we have.
So I think we're trying to use some of the tools that we have in DHS, not speaking for the White House. Last year, we issued we have the authority to issue what's called a binding operational directive, which is it's a bureaucratic term for essentially a rule that essentially forbade government entities from using Kaspersky software. Kaspersky is a firm that makes antivirus software. Its founder is Russian. And when we looked at the total risk the risk landscape of the legal regime in Russia, what this technology does, inability to kind of verify the integrity of the applications, we issued that. It's been upheld all the way up to the Court of Appeals. And so I think we are trying to be more aggressive. To your point, that EO has not been fully realized. But I think it's from where I sit, we have one regulatory authority, which is over the chemical sector. So we regulate security standards for chemical facilities. Everything else are voluntary partnerships. And so I am in the business of trying to compel and invite participation in that partnership, that notion of collective defense, that what's your risk in the private sector is my risk in government, and that together we need to better understand the threat landscape, the vulnerabilities, and more importantly, how do we lower that risk? And so, to John's point, we are trying to share more information. We're trying to issue more clearances and even SCIFs to private sector entities to push that information. In exchange, we're asking for insight into what's on companies' networks. So we're not there yet. I wasn't trying to assume that we were, but I think, and I haven't been in the job that long, only a year, I think it's trending in the right direction. I think the experience we had with the social media companies during the election, the run-up to the midterms, is a testament to some of that improvement in that there was trust being built, and on election day, we had all the Silicon Valley companies, in addition to the DNC and the RNC, in our ops center on election night. And we were able to take some of those signatures and share them with the Twitters and the Facebooks of the world. Let them do it.
But I want to, if I go back to your question about sort of where Silicon Valley is, I mean, I think some of this is the continued maturation of that whole industry, which was born out of this very utopian vision for what the internet and cyberspace was going to do. And it was very much this concept, and I think there were a lot of people in Silicon Valley that bought into this idea that, like, the internet and cyberspace would be used for unalloyed good, and that it would make the world flat, and it would spread democracy, and and spread human rights, and do all these great things. And yet now we've actually discovered that the internet is used for all these horrible things as well. And I think that what you're actually seeing is a lot of the industry, and I agree with Savannah. I mean, I think the number of companies where that's really the case is actually smaller than a lot of the perception was, and it's growing smaller as they've come back around to the knowledge of, a lot of, and I've actually seen this in some of the companies that we dealt with, where they were like all gung ho, well, we can't be too close to the US government because we got to do business in China. And they've discovered that the Chinese really don't have any interest in them doing business in China, only for so long as it takes them to suck all the information out of that company. And then they want them out. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, that glittering market of $1.5 billion.
It was helpful that they said so publicly. That's the
right.
Made in China 2025.
Yeah, and that suddenly that glittering market of $1.5 billion people didn't look so glittering anymore. And it may be working with the U.S. government, which is actually bound by a set of rules and laws that we actually adhere to, didn't seem quite so bad.
So I'd like to stay with this theme of the importance of the centrality of the private sector. The crown jewels are in the private sector here is what we're talking about. And this is a question I'll first put to you, Matthew, but I suspect you can't really answer it, and I'll ask everyone else to weigh in. You point out that when it comes to chemical facility safety, CISA has prescriptive authorities. And we see the same thing when it comes to the physical aspects of security and nuclear and other aspects of critical infrastructure. Does CISA or some other body need to have some degree of the same ability to prescribe and compel information sharing, and perhaps the adoption and uptake of certain security measures in the cyber domain for at least some zones of critical infrastructure?
So I think what you see in Europe is that approach, right? I think you're seeing more regulatory inclination, and I think that has certain effects on the marketplace. I'll say this, within DHS, we have unique convening authorities that other departments in the government do not have. It was written in the Homeland Security Act of 2003, which allows us to bring together private sector partners outside of the restrictions of FACA or business conflict of interest. And that is a convening authority that only we enjoy. So we hold that pretty dear. And so when I hear the term, you want to regulate more, nothing will wither that down quicker than if someone thinks they come to the table at DHS, I'm going to regulate them. So from our perspective, no, we very much believe in the partnership model of linking arms, sharing information, sharing best practices, technology development, exercises, training, the like. But there may be elsewhere in the government that may be considering that. We certainly aren't.
Well, John? Yeah, it's good. There needs to be, right now it's a bit of a hodgepodge approach and what's great is the work that's been done to try to apply the different authorities that exist in sectors and depending on your department or agency in a strategic manner. But it is a hodgepodge of authorities. So if it's healthcare information, it's HIPAA regulated and they're putting out a certain set of rules. If you're in the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, or you're a contractor, there's a different set of rules. If you're in the chemical sector, you can mandate certain rules, and then the Department of Energy has it. And then there are other sectors that kind of fall within the holes in that system, and they don't have any regulation at all, other than that which is coming from Europe and state attorney general offices and the FTC. That's all about the privacy of information. So I think as we look forward and see what the threats are, that approach doesn't make sense. And we need to start trying to move towards a more a holistic standard where there is some clear baseline that companies need to meet. And the thing that I see very much day to day in the private sector is they struggle with where to invest money. Is you're in a competition on their resources, right? And so if there's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and they know, well, we could go to jail, and there's clear guidance from my former department that says, here's what you need to do as a company. Otherwise, if someone pays a bribe overseas, the company itself may be criminally responsible. They're going to invest in compliance, and they do, and oversight. Mm-hmm. They don't have, there's no clear, we're all trying to persuade threats that we've seen them to take similar actions or investments, and once they've been hit, they make the investments, but there isn't as clear a demand signal in many sectors.
And I would just say that I think that regulation is actually inevitable for many of the sectors where we're starting to talk about the Internet of Things and the connectivity of those devices, because I will argue that once those devices become capable of killing people, we will regulate them. And so the question is, can we actually regulate them in a smart way that provides the right kind of incentives, that is not a simple set of checklists of the cybersecurity actions that were good 5 years ago, but how do we actually incentivize the market in the right way and do the regulations in the smart way? And that is also going to require our regulatory agencies to cooperate and collaborate in some ways that they haven't traditionally done, because they're very used to being the experts in their silos, but they're not necessarily cybersecurity experts. And so making sure that they actually draw on that expertise and don't try to promulgate regulations that are actually, in fact, stupid from a cybersecurity standpoint is going to be very important.
Michelle, were you about to?
Yes, as just reflecting on this, as this conversation has evolved, and we've talked appropriately a lot about the private sector, the crown jewels of our R&D being much in the private sector, I would hate for this audience to get the wrong impression. I would hate for you to get the impression this means that we don't need to worry about traditional espionage anymore, and that we don't need to worry about the traditional protection of national security secrets that pertain to our military and our intelligence activities. After all, this is a conference about intelligence in transition, and I will tell you the part that is not transitioning. The part that is not transitioning is our adversaries' interests in getting at our most closely held secrets. And to that end, I am heartened to see that the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, is now saying we need a reorientation to understand the traditional competitions with Russia and a rising China. And what that means for reorienting our intelligence work against them means doubly when it comes down to the counterintelligence side, understanding how those two nation states use their intelligence resources against us, to be sure to include on the economic espionage side, but on the traditional side as well. I don't want you to walk away with a fuzzy feeling that everything is fine, because it's not. So for example, as those of you who have CIA backgrounds will know, the sickness in your stomach that must have come back in the years between 2010 and 2012, when the Chinese rounded up virtually every source that CIA had within China. Over 30 individuals were rounded up and executed. Now, how did they find these people? Now, the speculation is there may have been a penetration, there may have been a compromise of some kind of communication systems, it may have been a combination of these things. But the result of that is a devastating loss to U.S. intelligence insights into what the Chinese are doing. And why does that matter? it matters because they care very much in shaping our perceptions and our understanding of what they're doing. It's all a part of their larger strategic aims. And one thing we haven't mentioned is that one of the major Chinese cyber actions against us was the raid on OPM. Now, it's not the only one, but it's one that's great concern to those of us who got our little notices in the mail saying, you know,
1, 2, 3,
sorry to
4,
tell
5,
you this, but all of your information has been compromised. And those of you who hold clearances know that it's, you know, it's not only your bank account, and it's where you've lived, and it's who you've talked to, and it's where your family is, and where you have worked. And if you ever consulted a doctor for mental health issues, then it's a whole range of things that give a foreign intelligence service the opportunity to spot those people who may be in positions of access, to assess their vulnerabilities, and potentially to approach them. So from a traditional espionage point of view, the 22 million personal files that were acquired through that one sustained raid on OPM is a gold mine. So if the Chinese have done damage to us, to our insights into them up till now, just you wait, because that's the gift that keeps on giving. Those files and others like that they have acquired. The Russians, one can tell a similar story, I'm sorry to say. And briefly on that, and then I'll surrender the microphone. We have not had an arrest of a Russian penetration into the US intelligence community in 18 years. In the 80s, there were like 11. After in the 90s, there were 9. The last one was Robert Hansen, 2001. And at that time, the damage assessments, which my old office was responsible for, made it quite clear that his insights alone and those of Rick Ames before him did not account for all the losses that we had. And we knew back then that we had at least one more penetration, probably more. And yet in those 18 years, we have found this many. So that shouldn't give you a warm feeling that we're doing a very good job against the Russian intelligence services either. Sorry for the sermon.
No, that was great. Samantha, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, you know, it's interesting because you didn't count Kaspersky, right? In Kaspersky Labs when you're talking about, you know, the
penetration.
Right, but isn't it all, you know, kind of, if you look at the new world of how to gain information and what's the best way to do it,
It's
you
a
know,
combination.
it is an
It's
absolute
the melding
combination,
of those
and
things.
I totally commend, you know, what was done on you know, purging Kaspersky Labs, you know, products.
Yes.
You know, people were trying to, you know, push that, you know, early, but it was great that it was done. I still hear ads for them. You know, you can still order their products online and have them, you know, delivered to your house. And Kaspersky Labs is one amongst many types of companies that are coming out of Russia and similar ones in China that are taking the place perhaps of the human insider. That's doing some of these things. Just a great example, because we wrote about it publicly. The Speech Technology Center grew out of KGB acoustics, right? So right there, you know, it should not be, you know, having a role in our economy. It does things like speech listening devices and acoustics and all of these great things. It still sells into U.S. law enforcement. Right? I mean, you know, we don't have our heads wrapped properly around this insidious threat of how new ways to gain intelligence and information, using new types of devices, using our economy against us. We're kind of opening our eyes. The private sector needs to have their eyes open way wider than it is. But this is the challenge that, you know, that we face.
You know,
really.
good development on that front is the Foreign Investment Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA. And this is the idea that we need to worry about traditional spycraft and spies, but it's just as bad if you're able to obtain the vulnerability through an acquisition. And so if you haven't seen it today, check out the newspaper and you'll see the acquisition of Grindr. Which is, you know, a hookup app was acquired by a Chinese company. And what's announced today is that the Committee on Foreign Investment, where I used to sit, which is a national security group and used to focus on the defense industrial base, has reached in and said, hey, you can't buy Grindr. That is sensitive information where you didn't need to hack your way into the Office of Personnel Management, but you just bought this huge database that could be used for blackmail or for figuring out people's patterns, practices. And so I think that's a great example of creatively using what the intelligence is showing the adversary is trying to do it, but then coming up with a new tool so you can disrupt that activity. Kaspersky is an example where you guys did a great job without a new tool, but not enough, not what you could do if you had the tool where you could just tell people, we don't think you should buy Kaspersky without getting sued and taking it up to the circuit court. I love those suits; they're great for lawyers, but they, it's not a clear authority that you had, right? You had to
Only
cobble
over federal
together
agencies,
hundreds.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, only
Well,
for
but the
federal
other thing that makes it more complicated, right, is that Kaspersky, it's not a front company. Kaspersky Labs is a really good cybersecurity company. Their product is excellent. They're a great team. They're cybersecurity researchers led by Konstantin Wright. There is nobody better out there at that. I mean, there are some that are peers, but they are good at what they do. That's what makes that even more complicated, because they are in fact actually a legitimate cybersecurity company. It just so happens that they work for a government that can, and are located in a country where the government can basically tell them, you will comply and you will support us, or you will be dead. So, I mean, it's, that's their underlying challenge.
I think the takeaway from this most recent round of exchange is, as Sue Gordon said earlier, the attack surface is growing exponentially. It's still, as Michelle said, it's every bit it ever was for the traditional targets within the government itself. But it's grown in leaps and bounds. And when we can say that Grindr is an aspect of, but of course it is, because that's valuable data. Theme of the conference. Now,
Fortnite is half owned by a Chinese company.
Fortnite. So the teenagers of America are all exposed. Let's involve you guys. We're gonna stop on time, so I want to make sure to start involving the audience now as quickly as possible. And if we can get one of the microphones to come right here, Diane, up here towards the front, Dennis, and then we'll go back to the gentleman there. So, right here. And Nora, if you could get the microphone to the gentleman there next to you, has his hand up.
One of the things that you hear from Lighthizer and others is this idea of decoupling. What about decoupling of the digital domain? Is this something that we can actually consider? What's the upside? What's the downside? I mean, do any of you actually advocate the digital decoupling of the Chinese and American economies?
So I would say as a technical matter, I don't actually think that's possible. I think not without an enormous amount of investment and a complete re-architecting of the underlying digital infrastructure, which is a mind-boggling task. In fact, I actually think that the digital world and the physical world are becoming even more tightly intertwined. And so I think that and that while we might be able to succeed in sort of erecting some buffers and some resilience in there, I think doing that in its entirety is going to be actually impossible.
Not quite the same issue, but Russia has announced plans to try to essentially turn off the internet here. I think next week.
Yeah.
And whether or not that technically can be done or not, it's certainly an interesting notion to even try to kind of decouple yourself from the rest of the world electronically.
To bring the discussion back home, tomorrow night, the University of Texas basketball team plays in a tournament in New York City. Every good basketball team has a defense and it has an offense. We have heard an awful lot over the last day of defense in the United States against cyber warfare. Can you assure us that we have a similar capability of cyber offense against our adversaries? We have not heard much since Stuxnet in 2007 in association with the Israelis for the Iranian nuclear facilities. Do we develop tools, and without telling us the building in which these tools are being invented, are we also working with other countries to have a capability to attack back?
Sounds like a good question as a former cybersecurity coordinator.
So, yes. Okay. So to expand a little bit on that, what I would say is that one of the things that you very quickly learn when you actually start unpacking a lot of this space is that the ability to do something to somebody somewhere is trivial. The ability to have the impact that you want at the time and place of your choosing, and only the impact that you want without unintended consequences at the time and place of your choosing, is really, really hard. And this is why it always amuses. I travel a lot, and so I love bad action movies. I'm a big fan of bad action movies on airplanes. They entertain me. And it endlessly fascinates me that no computer hack takes longer than a 30-second pan shot. And now, so the hacker sits down, and she usually sits down at the keyboard, and you get about, okay, we're in. Now, it doesn't work that way. And so the ability to actually generate those kinds of offensive effects through cyberspace is way more complicated than Hollywood would want you to believe. And so while yes, we're developing those capabilities, they should not be used in isolation. They need to be used in conjunction with tools like what John was talking about, the economic sanctions, indictments, and diplomatic action. And it's only when you actually marry all of those capabilities together, along with our intelligence activities, covert action, all those other kinds of things, it's only then that those kinds of tools are actually effective at changing the behavior that we want to change.
But I'd love to jump in on this question, because I think that is really an important question. And many of you may recall there was a story in the press that was not long after the 2018 elections, reporting on a action that had been taken by Cyber Command to disable the Russian Information Resources Agency, research agency.
The troll farm.
There you go, the troll farm, as a sort of a shot to see this is a part of what we can do, with the understanding that the reach is likely to be more and greater than that for future things. But the whole notion of going on offense is something that is so extraordinarily important, and it is something that we need to spend more time thinking about and understanding how we do that. And I will tell you that when I was first asked, I first became the head of counterintelligence. I was the first person in history to hold that job, because in times past, all of our counterintelligence responsibilities had been dispersed between the FBI, the CIA, and the military services, and they worked in their own domains, and they didn't work together. But what we have seen, what we've talked about today, is the threats that the United States faces that are diverse and new and different are strategic. The threats are not to the FBI alone or to CIA alone, they are to the country. And the question is, how do you understand those threats? And how do you get ahead of them? And how do you disable them? How do you take the fight to the foreign adversary? And that is something we need to understand when it comes to intelligence threats as much as it does in the terrorism world, which is the lesson we took out of 9/11. Take the threat to them, not wait till it comes here. So this is a new way of thinking about how you do the counterintelligence business to go on the offense. And we tried to do that under the Bush administration, but I will tell you that that effort fell to the wayside because the counterterrorism activities were so much sucking up the air and national security attention that the nascent efforts that we made to try to turn our CI capabilities into an offensive instrument were set aside. Now we were faced with these new challenges, these strategic challenges, and the time has come really to revisit that orientation of our counterintelligence instruments and to find a way to get strategic about it. Someone here mentioned Andy Marshall earlier today, and he was the head of net assessment in the Pentagon for such a long time. I would give you this thought that we need to think about foreign intelligence threats to the United States and our ability to deal with those threats as a net assessment problem, which means what is the red side capability against us, and what are the blue side, what are the resources that we have to deal with that? What are the gaps? What are the things we need to do better? Where do we need to fill in? And frankly, I will tell you, up until now, we've not thought about our counterintelligence mission in that kind of terms. So one of the challenges that faces the US government as we try to understand this variety of things is how do we make our counterintelligence instrument more effective against modern threats?
So, Bobby had mentioned that I'm a commissioner on a new congressional, and I'm speaking only in my private capacity here, but commissioner on a new congressional commission called the Cyber Solarium Commission. It was written into last year's National Defense Authorization Act. 4 members of Congress are on it, and 6 outsiders, of whom I'm one. And one of the reasons that it was created, it was an echo back to President Eisenhower's Solarium Commission on the best way to deal with the rising Soviet threat. Is it containment? Is it deterrence? Is it a mix? Is it some other things? And Congress was getting antsy and itchy that we haven't really thought about the larger strategic battle space that we live in this cyber world that we occupy. And on your question on offense, well, not going to get into what's being done on the offense. Herman Kahn, the great Cold War strategist, had said one of the pillars of deterrence is that your adversary has to see and believe and understand what you can do to them, right? And I think some of the problems, at least I have, with potential offensive things that are going on in this space, they are not seen enough. They're not seen enough by the adversary that we may be targeting, and certainly by other adversaries, and they're not seen enough by the American people to know that the government has their back, that the government is doing something, and it's not just that the American people and their vulnerabilities in cyberspace, that they just have to lay there with their neck bared. We haven't yet figured out all the tools. Clearly, there are tools way outside the cyber realm, and they should be, to have the effect of what above-ground nuclear testing had the effect of concentrating the mind of the adversary. Right? It wasn't an act of war because we did it over our territory, but it was very clear the capabilities that we had and could bring to bear if needed.
But I think we need to think carefully about what is the most effective tools to show on deterrence. I think we all agree on taking the fight. The fight needs to be taken more to the adversary. But if it's a strategic approach, you want to hit your enemy where you're strong and they're weak. And the fact is, we moved further and faster than any other country in the world to take everything that we value and turn it from books and papers into digital space, into bits and bytes, and then connect it through a protocol that's fundamentally vulnerable. There is no internet-connected system today in the government or private sector that's safe from a dedicated adversary who wants to get in. So it may be that the best response to a North Korean cyber attack is not knocking the 10 people who are online in North Korea offline, but instead looking, where are we strong? We're strong in the credibility of our criminal justice system. When we bring a charge, the world believes the conduct occurred, unlike if Russia uses its court system or China. We're strong in our economy and the dollar. So that's why sanctions have proven to be such a powerful tool. I hope we will continue to be strong where we have been strong, which is in our alliances and in the fact that people want to come to the United States and like our system of government. It's why Putin, I think, is attacking democracies. He sees them as an existential threat. So our diplomatic efforts have been strong. And so while cyber and our military toolkit in that space shouldn't be left off the table as one of the tools, for a while when it came to what do you do against a cyber attack, all of the focus was on how you hit back in cyber. And I'm not sure that'll be the right or most effective way to deter some of these adversaries.
Well said. I was tempted to try to squeeze in one last question, but I'm mindful that several of our panelists have to race to the airport. They were making a sacrifice to stay this late, and they may end up staying longer than they meant to if we don't get them out of here on time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Please do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.